Right, for now, let's jump into the panel discussions. Thank you very much, David, for that. We'll definitely hear a lot more from you. We'll call you back to the stage, but let me just give a bit of context. Now, as has been mentioned, national data governance efforts in Africa are progressing slowly. We still have a lot of work to do, but one of the biggest issues is inconsistency in the way we approach, and of course, a very fragmented approach to that. Policy is different in different countries, and we'll hear exactly what's happening with Rwanda's case, and then we'll probably try and touch on what's happening within the region. To help me answer those questions on the role of multi-stakeholder cooperation in shaping Africa's data, allow me to call on stage the panelists. Roland Price, Rwanda Country Manager for the World Bank. Round of applause. Chido Munyati, Head of Africa for the World Economic Forum. Ndayishimiye Ale, Project Lead for AI and Machine Learning at C4IAR, Rwanda. And of course, back on stage, David Kanamugire, CEO of the NCSA. All right. Let's kick things off with David. We'd like to know how broad to have our conversation, right? Data protection, data governance, data security, we could all use them within the same breath, but they mean very different things. On a personal level, for a lot of people, it's making sure WhatsApp does not collect your data, so you start seeing ads of fridges when you were just speaking to someone about getting ice from the fridge. For some people, it's covering the camera, where, on your laptop. On a national level, it means something else. So how broad is the conversation on data governance and data security to now craft what we're talking about, the data protection landscape?
Thank you so much. So first of all, let's set the stage. To begin with, every single transaction generates a piece of information contained in the data sets it generates. So if you are making a payment, there will be some set of information. Your bank details, the amount of money you are transacting, who you are sending it to, the purpose for which. And this data goes through several hands. Not all of them have the same appreciation of the value and the importance. A bank just might want to look at the value of it. But to the person whose data you are sending, they might have specific areas that they don't wish to be public. And that's the essence of personal data. It's like, well, you are welcome to my house, but not to every room. So yes, there is part you want to share for efficiency, for economic transactions and others. And there is a part that is so personal that will live long with you and those you love and care for that must be protected. Unfortunately, over several years, the challenge has been, can we get data to flow faster between point A and point B so we get business done? That has been achieved by broadband policies. That data now is stored in cloud, in databases, in platforms. But now people say, how safe is my data? In whose hands is it? How do I guarantee that it will not be used against me? That there won't be a data breach? So this conversation is about balancing the security of data, ensuring business efficiency, and ensuring privacy of the people for whom the data is. And it shifts the discussion significantly that, yes, you hold my data because you are a bank, but it's my data. And you can only do what I've told you to do with it, and I can walk out if I want and switch banks, and you must make sure that the law says now, if you breach my data, you've broken the law. And that's the set.
Right. Perfect. That definitely sets the stage, right? So we're good to go. So since the conversation is on having many stakeholders discuss this particular topic, let's have the question for Roland and Alain. Most of the time when you're discussing this, you need a framework and then you need execution. So execution meaning a budget. Now the money's there, we have the players there, and we already have the structure there. Why do we need more players? Why exactly would we need more than the people that are already doing the fundamentals to make sure that the landscape is well catered to? Roland?
Certainly. I'm not sure that what we need are more players. I think that based upon what David said, data is everywhere, it's big. It can be used for good and it can be used for evil. So you already have a number of stakeholders that David already mentioned, right? You have the bank, you have the person, and I probably would go a little bit further than David has gone, where it's not just about protection. He's from the Data Protection Office, so he cares a lot about that, right? But we want to also be able to use data to sort of improve people's lives, not just per se transact business, but there are ways that we were able to see, for example, how they did contact tracing when we had COVID, and that meant that some of your information about, where you were and what you were doing might have been used, but it was a sort of public good, a benefit for others. So it's not always about transacting business, it's about other things. And so when they're talking about multi-stakeholder participation, I think generally when we say governance, we expect that the government is going to be responsible for that. But the reality is there are so many players, and they come from different perspectives, right? What government is probably the largest player when it comes to generating data. There are many other suppliers, and they're users of that data. So they're wanting to bring all of those parties into a room and say, how do we manage this well? What is it that we want to keep safe? Where we get permission to use things, then what is the best way to do that? Do we put it in hubs? How do we ensure that private sector can access it? How do we ensure that government is able to utilize that? And that's why I think they're saying, when we talk about multi-stakeholder, it's bringing all of the various stakeholders into the room and saying, how are you going to best manage this data to benefit people, right? While keeping the stuff that we need to keep private.
Right. And let me ask now this particular question, since we gave it in context. Of course, what's happening in Rwanda is not the same as what's happening across the border. Tanzania, South Africa, Kenya, you name it. So even as we craft this center and we hope to replicate some of the successes from here to other places, being that it's first being launched here, then how do you work around a multi-stakeholder approach, but saying, okay, we have this template, but we need you to customize it to your country?
Thank you. You said it right. I think in each context, we need to look at the national priorities. What are the intentions within the policies? What are the long-term goals for each particular settings? So for a multi-stakeholder kind of setup, we're looking at perspectives within voices. So what is your thoughts within each stakeholder? How do you identify the problem? What are the new modes of solution solving? So in a context where you need to borrow from other best practices, we really need to understand what is best fit, because there's no one size fits all to these kinds of situations, but borrowing best practices is fundamental in the sense that it gives us the possibility to learn from what others have done, but also adapt it to a setting that really makes sense to a particular situation.
Right. We'll come back, just hold that thought, we'll come back to you. Let's speak a bit from the World Economic Forum. A perspective. So we want very restricted, we want people to be very aware of their data. Some people call it nationalism, protectionism of their data as well, but we want data to be accessible for all so that it can help plug into things like the AFCFTA. So how do you strike that balance? I want the data to myself, but I want you to have it. How do you do that?
Thank you for that question. So the broader context is the 2014 Malabo. So the broader context is the 2014 Malabo Convention for Cybersecurity and Data Protection, which is an attempt to provide a common framework for data protection in the region. So ideally, we would have a common framework similar to what you have in Europe with a general data protection regulation. That way, you have a single policy for a region. Unfortunately, the Malabo Convention is only being ratified by 8 countries, including Rwanda. So short of that, as you were mentioning, the multi-stakeholder process is a mechanism of ensuring that at least we get to a minimum baseline of data protection across borders. So how do we get unified principles and obligations whereby we don't end up with a patchwork of different data policy protection laws. I'm sure there are a lot of startups that are here today who would probably find it prohibitively expensive to scale their businesses because they're trying to comply with different costs and complexities in different jurisdictions. And so I think, as to your question about how do we balance these obligations, certainly, yes, you want to make sure that citizens are protected and there's a minimum level of protection. But to your point, there also have to be incentives to encourage startups as well as the bigger businesses. So referring to some of the heavier data-intensive sectors, so your FANGs, your Facebooks, your Amazons, your Netflixes, your Googles, what is the incentive for them to scale their investments? Because if you want to take a practical look at it, less than 5% of their global revenues come from Africa. And so if they have to look at this landscape and they're like, okay, in order to transfer data from the US to optimize our services, we're going to have to go through 44 different jurisdictions. I think we have to also be open to establishing some sort of minimum baseline.
Right.
Yeah.
Just picking up on that, David, let me just ask something, because a crucial point, of course, has been the use of social media networks and the platforms that we have really available on our phones, right? So for everyone here, one of the biggest issues anytime you download an app is checking, actually, question. When's the last time you clicked on, what's that? Have you read the terms and conditions?
This morning.
Almost never, right? You just scroll and click, right? You're good to go. And most of the time you're selling, and then you come later and you're starting to see what you clicked on being discussed on Twitter. And you say, hey, I didn't agree to that. But let's touch on that for a bit. Most of the data, most of the rules and things that we agree to is basically your data is going to be collected and repatriated or expatriated, you name it, wherever, to a different place, right? A different jurisdiction. So as government or as a cybersecurity authority, now maintaining that data without infringing on the different companies' rules or policies, how do you work that out? For example, Facebook and WhatsApp have huge amounts of data they've collected from Rwanda particularly. But you have to get, as you'll explain, some bit of that data to utilize internally as government. So help us understand how that works.
Thank you. I think when it gets to social media, I'm not sure anyone clearly understands this involvement because you possibly have more users than the world population. So all those people behave differently online. And each of the technology service providers has their own internal rules and regulations. And they all claim to be protecting the rights and the rights to privacy of individuals. So they have, some actually have like 50 pages of very fine print. And they ask you questions that you might not even be able to answer. Do you not want to click on this? And even if you say yes, you actually mean no. And so the questions are posed in a way that you serve the business interests and not protect the privacy of this. This is why these registrations come handy. Now they are saying, because of privacy reasons, the obligation is for those companies to ensure privacy by default. And if you followed what has been happening, a lot of these companies have been fined heavily, up in some cases 10% of their global revenue for data breach and infringement of privacy rights. This was not the case a few years ago. It was all profit, collect data, process it, use it for marketing and other reasons. Now every single jurisdiction have put in place legislation requirements mandating those users, amongst other things, to collect data based purely on consent and to collect that consent in an unambiguous manner. You have to ask me and tell me ahead of time, I'm collecting your data, and you state which data, and I'm going to use it for this purpose. It's called purpose limitation. And it has duration limitation. I'm collecting this data for the purpose of enrolling you in a school, and we will erase it as soon as you graduate. And we will not use it for anything beyond which we have collected, and the law exists to enforce that. Should you differ from that because you have a financial muscle, then you are not dealing with that subject, data subject or the user, you are now dealing with the law. So the presence of this law makes sure that even if these companies hold data, there are legal obligations that they must comply with. The challenge has been their market position and their power in the market. They've put a lot of pushback. But now the laws are there, and the law exists to protect the privacy of users. So it's a new space, it's a new development, but we hope it will significantly address those challenges.
Right. Chiro, let me come back to you. Within your docket, of course, AFCFTA has been thrown around a lot. But one of the biggest issues when AFCFTA came about was that it was going to be a platform where the big dogs play, right? The big fish, the big industries. This digital platform has enabled a lot of techpreneurs, a lot of young guys to come in. Where is their space when they're trying to access some of this data to influence their businesses being set up? Someone who doesn't even have maybe $1,000 to set up a tech business, for example. How do they plug in into such a huge ecosystem?
Yes, unfortunately, I don't have good news for you on that. The AFCFTA, the largest free trade agreement in the world by number of people and landmass, went into effect over a year and a half ago, but it doesn't have a policy for data protection in it, which is, yeah, remarkable and unbelievable at the same time. And so, you know, there is an ambition within this framework to scale digital trade and digital services, but it doesn't provide for a regional data policy law. So I guess the assumption is that the Malabo Convention, which again has only been ratified by 8 countries, including Rwanda, was supposed to provide that regional policy. So short of that, I think really it's going to be efforts such as what we're seeing in Rwanda, multi-stakeholder approaches, consulting different institutions, lawyers, banks, academia, civil society, citizens, to ensure that they sort of at least reach a reasonable standard whereby there are common obligations and principles, you know, across the region. But yeah, you know, to your point, there really isn't a mechanism in the AFCFTA. It doesn't exist.
So for the young guys, the people who are just starting up, they're on their own. So it's basically jurisdiction shopping at this point. Okay.
They have to go to Rwanda, comply in Rwanda, then go to Zimbabwe, comply with Zimbabwe, and so I think the idea is that hopefully countries will take frameworks such as what's been done in Rwanda and replicate them. And so I guess that's where the multi-stakeholder approach is really important.
All right, perfect. So yes.
Maybe I'd just like to say something about that. Data is different than other things, right? Yeah. It's sort of intangible. We can't see it. We know it's everywhere. And what you're asking about is whether you could, you know, sort of what are the challenges around having a kind of harmonized system? And we're asking about a harmonized system in what you're saying is the biggest market, right? 1.2 billion people, $2 billion market in terms of its value. The fact is that doing anything regional, right? A regional air transport agreement or, you know, something that's far more challenging and tangible, really, it's very difficult to achieve consensus, right? And you need a leader. You know, Rwanda is one of those leaders, and maybe the other 8 countries also are doing something. But then you need to somehow find a way to bring others on board. They need to be incentivized, or they need to see the value in doing what Rwanda is doing, right? In doing what some of these other countries are doing. And so it's almost moral suasion, right? Or logic. By demonstrating the benefit to Rwanda, does it bring additional revenues to Rwanda to have a system like this? Are people going to choose Rwanda as a jurisdiction to set up business because it has a very clear data protection framework and an ecosystem that enables the exchange of data and the utilization of that data? When other countries see that, that might be motivation then for them to say, oh, maybe we need to get on board. And when there is, you know, in the work that we do, at the World Bank, one of the things that we try to do when we're convincing, we try to show countries what the cost of not doing it well is. So in this, you know, African Continental Free Trade Agreement, there's a significant opportunity. Data does not stop at the border. So I keep giving COVID references, maybe it's just COVID trauma, but, just like how COVID did not stop at the border, and a country that managed very well its own response to COVID could still be impacted. Similarly, if you have a really amazing data governance system that stops at your border, you're not necessarily going to be able to fully unlock all of the benefits of a regional agreement like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And so at the bank, one of the things that we would want to do is to show what potential benefits there could be. What happens in this scenario when there is no agreement or no space to collaborate, where there is no harmonization of regulatory or policy frameworks, and what could happen? What is the potential if that harmonization took place? And when assuming that we're dealing with logical people, sometimes political will is challenging and political economy pushes against making a rational decision. But for most people, when you see the two align, the two different scenarios, and realize that a scenario with harmonized data policies, harmonized data governance, actually is going to bring you a greater benefit economically and in other ways, the likelihood is that you will be persuaded to move towards that.
Right.
And this is a function of time.
Do we have anything on smaller businesses joining the large ecosystem? We still haven't answered that part. Smaller techpreneurs getting into this space. We'd like to hear whether the C4IR has anything on that, but we still haven't answered that bit. Where is the space for small businesses to plug in when we're discussing data? David, you wanted to say something?
Not about that, but I can comment to it. But I just wanted to comment on what you said, which is very, very important, about cross-border data flow. If one part, if you think of it as a system, maybe a saturated system in a human body, the part of the body that doesn't receive blood gets cut off, damaged in the end. And we have businesses across borders. And in a digital economy, the transaction, that blood is the data. So if we have different sets of legislations in some countries, some areas they work hard, others don't, then the average really goes low. So there is also a need, beyond getting it right in a single jurisdiction, to a common regional data flow framework. Right. And that's something we also have to push when we are talking about these data protection policies. It cannot, and I think you mentioned about Malabo Convention and others, some of it have to be along regional economic blocks, because trade involves exchange of data. If you look at telecom companies, for example, the money transfers goes along with personal data, but they are regulated differently, they are legislated differently, and there needs now to be a move beyond getting one set right to many others, and that comes through that data governance framework, the cross-border data flows. And this is not an easy thing, even in other developed economies. I was reading online that only yesterday, GDPR, the European Union, was talking to other countries whether they can actually exchange economic data. This is only yesterday, and this GDPR has been in existence for a couple of years. But there has to be a lot of goodwill, a lot of cooperation, and this is a discussion that can be done, but it's so vital. Back to your question of small companies that can get into this space. We've seen a lot happen in Rwanda. Yeah. I don't know if people here use Tap and Go or Pay. There are lots of companies in Rwanda that have leveraged building data, the way we buy our cash power, energy purchasing, the way we transfer money. These are small, medium enterprises that are building companies, sometimes leveraging networks of bigger corporations like MTN, but in the end, these applications are developed by young people. Very happy to see a couple of them here. And they have a space. All they have to be is to say, I have this application, so Tap and Go, how the motor people are paying, how we order food online, how we buy cash power for, nobody goes to a vendor to, no, these things are done here.
Nice.
But we don't see them, they are not advertising, but they are there. So we have now to be very deliberate to promote them, to encourage them, and showcase them. And possibly that's where we need to work on, but they are there.
Perfect. That definitely answers that. Great. Now, time for a quick 15 to 20 minutes. If you have any question, please just raise your hand and we'll come to you. Any question on data, data protection, data governance, data security, anything data? Any question whatsoever? There's one question there, another question there. Oh, there's a microphone, right?
I think. Hi. So my question is for the Data Protection Office. Sorry, I'm Frando Lin from Vitruvian MD. We're a health tech company looking in the computer vision and AI diagnostic space. And the question comes from that sense where, you know, the Human Tissue Act of 2004 regulates how human tissue can be transported, stored, you know, sent across borders, etc. But a digital image of human tissue or of blood doesn't count as human tissue, right? Because otherwise all textbooks would be human tissue. So how does the Data Protection Office look at de-identified digital images of human tissue, let's say?
That's a very specific question. Bless you.
Now I see the danger of using examples I don't understand. So I use the biological case, not that I have any expertise in that, but just as an analogy. But when it gets to tissues, I'm like lost. But I can talk generally about what we consider to be sensitive personal data in which that category belongs. Healthcare data is part of personal data that our law classifies as sensitive personal data that has special case of registration requirements. So if any image you are going to contain, to share, store, transfer, transmit, adapt, erase, or do any processing on, you will be required to apply separately from any other registration requirements. And the reason being, it's not only protecting the personal data, but also the very vital part of personal privacy. So any clinical imagery, any laboratory details, any other information is specifically protected by the law in a category that is called sensitive personal data. So that image and any other thing clinical related to that is sensitive personal data, and the Data Protection Office processes it in a special category. And that's because it's in the category of healthcare records, and that one is treated as sensitive. So I don't know if we can use a general case for other medical information to look at that specific image data, but I think all clinical information is classified as such. Thank you.
Does that answer your question? So
one part that we can talk about, the law requires that any sensitive personal data is pseudo-anonymized. And by pseudo-anonymization, we mean it cannot be stored in an identifiable manner by a human being. So practically, the keys that encrypt it must be stored in various locations, under various authorities, and accessed in special conditions. So does it answer that now? Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. We only move on if answered. All right. Yes?
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I'm Tsibanen Tlatlapa from South Africa. I head the C4IR in South Africa. And the question is more, again, to David. I wish I was asking another person. It's about how far does the data protection law in Rwanda goes as far as criminalization of certain activities. And maybe just to be clear, the framework could establish the regulatory authorities who will then establish the certain regulations for the transgressors. But does it even criminalizes those such that they can actually be prosecuted under the Criminal Procedure Act and so on? So just to clarify, in South Africa, it's not the same case. We have a data protection law that has come into effect over the past 2 years. And we have had to specify specific areas that are then criminalized in a different act. That if you have transgressed on those, you can be charged criminally. Does it go to that far?
I think this is where now I need a lawyer by my side. So I'm going to attempt to answer generally because I have limited or no expertise in legal matters. So first and foremost, our data protection law has several considerations about violations or breaches. Some are administrative breaches, like data breach with no criminal intent. Others are deliberate breaches with criminal intent. Others are pure mismanagement cases. Others are data breached for the purpose of enabling, let's say, criminal. So depending on which category, the Data Protection Office works with other organs, not independently, in pursuing, depending which case you are pursuing. So if it is criminal in nature, chances are that the Data Protection Office will work with our judicial system to pursue that in that line. If it is administrative, the law sets penalties and are established in the law, which could be a percentage of global turnover, or it could be a deregistration and be denied the service, the right to process that function. So I'm not sure I can be very specific about this, partly because now we have to take the privilege of being young. The law has been for only 3 months. We have 18 months to comply, fully comply. We have not met a single case where we can have a precedence, but practically, if the breach isn't with criminal intent, then it is handled within the normal prosecution. Thank you.
We have 1.5 years to hold you to account. By that time, it will be mature enough for us to discuss it.
Thank you.
All right, there we go.
Now I know you keep record of how long people say.
We definitely will. Right, okay, the hands have shot up now. So I think we would start, where's the microphone? Is it there? Oof. All right, let's speak. If you hear your question answered, it's okay to also just lower it, but we could start from there, just going this way. We'll pick 5 questions and then we'll wrap up today's session. Please just quickly, real quick questions.
Thank you. Hirwa Marie Faustine Chanel, a student from Rwanda Coding Academy, and I have 2 questions. How do data protection centers sense what data is at risk during a breach, and how do they deal with the financial impact of high-risk data if leaked? Thank you.
Perfect. Sensing sensitivity and the financial implication.
Okay, my name is Roger. I'm just have this a comment and question at the same time. The concern Georgie has raised about SMEs, like in Europe with the GRDP regulation, they are trying to loosen it because SME are not able to cope with the condition or the costs of implementing the thing. So this is one of the comment I would like to make about it. The second point is that the law, or the way Mr. David has mentioned, or saying that people have to register before to the Data Protection Office. I don't know if it's a requirement, like tap and go, let's say, as an example, you say they generate data, then they have to regulate it. Do we have to start first to register at that office, and then it become another hurdle for SMEs? That's my question. Thank you.
Okay. That's the third question.
Thank you. My name is Molly Rigamba. I just want to compliment on what David just said about criminal sanctions or criminal liability in the data protection law. Actually, the data protection law provides for criminal liability, and the maximum, I think the maximum penalty or imprisonment is up to 7 years, if I remember very well. So yes, just to help answer the question that the gentleman from South Africa raised. My question is also to David. Sorry, David, you're on the spot.
We could all just leave. It could be a spotlight session. We could do a TED talk.
Yeah. So my question is, in terms of data protection, I know in the financial sector they've been struggling with in-house data centers to make sure that data is not housed out of the country, or if it's even housed on the cloud, there's ways of monitoring that. So I'd like to ask David in terms of enforcement. We've seen that having in-house data centers is very expensive. I think for the banks that have gone into this, it costs more than $2 million. So how are you going to enforce that, also including how the financial implications that are related to it? So usually when you're to implement a law, you have to make sure that's implementable. So if the expense is too high, how is that going to be managed?
I think we could start with answering those so we don't lose track. So the first question was on sensing sensitivity. How do you, during the case of a breach, how do you sense sensitivity of some of the data when there's a breach? And then the second one was, of course, on the financial implication that has also been referenced to in the fourth question. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So I think in terms of detecting a data breach, there are no technical means for that. There is a legal requirement for self-reporting, where you must report a breach within maximum, I think, 48 hours. And it's a legal requirement. When a breach occurs, you have to inform the supervisory authority that a breach has happened, and you have to inform the concerned data subjects. And that's set in the law. So it's a requirement, whoever, and then the supervisory authority goes to ascertain in more detail the cause, whether it was technical or criminal, or even NM. So the requirement is self-reporting, which is mandated by law. And the financial implication, this is one of the things we mentioned about this law being monumental in nature, is it imposes some regulatory burdens for compliance. But it's also staggered in a period of 2 years to make sure that there is a smooth transition to full compliance. So yes, there will be some financial implications. It's because data has only been collected up to now with no particular emphasis on its protection and guaranteeing privacy. But now the law is there, so there is a cost of compliance, but it's not significant as the cost of non-compliance. So it's cheaper to comply than not to comply, because at least the cost is not calculated in the percentage of revenue. So that's what I can say. Roger, yes, it's important. Roger's question, the law requires that any processing of personal data requires registration first. But then that's why you have 2 years to comply, so we're all good for now. And I was happy when Molly answered the question, but I didn't know there was a caveat to it. So, yes, thanks for the first part, and the hard part is harder. So 7 years, yes, criminally, thanks for that. You can be, there's a criminal provision for that, thanks for clarification. But on the cost of data centers, this is one area where we are seeing significant pushback. And we say, someone say it's cheaper for me, if you are a multinational organization, to store data wherever you have the infrastructure. But again, the law does not categorically, is not set for a particular organization. It says for the country, a certain data must reside in a certain location if there is some idea of something we call sufficiency requirement. If it meets the same security requirements as enshrined in the Rwandan law, then yes, you can. But it ceases it to be automatic. In other words, you can store your data if you are allowed to in a location that is proven to be safe and secure, whose laws protect Rwandans' rights as they would protect those of their citizens.
Right.
And that is the adequacy condition that determines whether data can be ported. So it doesn't say you can't. It says you must do it in a secure manner. And it goes back to that same principle. Yes, process data based on the principle that you have the consent of the owner, you have sufficient organizational safeguards to protect it, and you understand the obligation to guarantee the privacy of the users. So the law doesn't say do or don't. It just says obtain permission and follow the law.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Please allow us to have one. I'm sure for most of you, your question has been answered. Okay, so just two questions, and then we'll close the session because we need to go into the next one. Please. Make it as tough as possible for the rest of the panelists as well.
Thank you.
My name is Daphne Tona from the African Leadership University. I'm a student. My question goes to, in regards to data protection law and data governance in general. As we're talking about the subjects of the data being talked about here, do the public know that the things that they should be able to look out towards to in terms of if there has been a data breach, does the public know what to look out for in terms of a data breach? Thank you.
The last question.
Thank you very much. I'm Augustine Chiza from the AE Trade Group. So also my question goes to the data centers and data storage. We've been seeing some problems back in days where some companies were storing data across borders, and then they would be charged for that, but also the same company will charge those fines the customers. So the company has breached the data laws, and then once they are charged with those breach, they charge the same amount to the customer again. So the end user is the one to be blamed on the cost. So we saw that. So also to complement, the AE Trade Group is building the data center here in Rwanda. So I think that's a very good thing to consider. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All closed out. Any pressing question that we've...
One pressing.
One last, that one there. Okay.
We have a tenacious one. Okay.
Thank you. I'll go the opposite side and talk about data availability. Does the Data Protection Office ensure that digital public goods is available and provided by government institutions and private institutions? Example, it can be weather data, health data, financial data. And then also, the question will also go to Alain. Is there a plan to educate various stakeholders, public and private institutions, on availing digital public goods? Thank you.
Perfect, thanks. You want to start with the last one, or we could go with the rest, and then we'll talk about digitally available public goods after. So let's start off. The question from the ALU student was whether the public knows what to look out for in terms of a breach. I think we are all collectively, unanimously Lois, you could just go ahead with that one.
Thank you. So I think the answer is there is a lot of education and awareness raising to educate users about their rights and privileges. This is going to happen, but one of the roles of Data Protection Office is to educate and raise awareness about individual rights and obligations of companies, but people know what to do in the event they feel that their privacy has been breached. So it's not enough, but yes, it will happen and it's core. And so I think the simple answer, it's a result of education and awareness raising.
And maybe to add on what Conor David said, within this 2 year or 1.5, I think, I don't know how you calculated it.
1.5, yeah.
1.5. So there's a government plan actually to start that kind of campaign, just to bring out the awareness. I would encourage everybody here to start following the NCSA Twitter page. They've been actually very active in that sense, putting out short but very relevant information that's specific to the question you asked. So how do we protect ourselves? What are your rights as a data subject? What are the consequences? And on the other side too, how do we ensure that your privacy, again, at the end of the day, and safety of your data is ensured? Thank you.
Got you, noted. There was a question on the problems with the data storage across borders and of course double charging for users as well. Could we couple that with what's been happening in Rwanda? We saw in 2016 a regional internet exchange point launched here. So how different is that from a data protection office when we already had an internet exchange point and a body governing that as well? So maybe there's any possible overlaps, even when you talk about data storage and double charging, and maybe where the mandates seem to cross.
Thank you. I think that the Data Protection Office is a custodian of this law, as opposed to being a physical infrastructure or a facility.
Perfect, yeah.
It's an office, it's an authority. It's named in other countries as Data Protection Authority, Data Protection Agency. UK calls it an office. So there are several, but it is an office with a legal mandate to observe the implementation of this law, to safeguard the rights of the citizens and whoever uses personal data in Rwanda. But also it has some technical systems, but that's for registration and others. Hosting, storage, and others remains in others. Remember, we're only talking about personal data. So it's not the other data sets remain wherever they used to be. This is only about personal data that is only protected by this law.
Okay. Last question was on, does the Data Protection Office have any considerations, or has it managed to accommodate digitally available goods?
So that's also one of the, I think it's related to the same level of complexity and magnitude like Molly's question. There has been this debate, data protection and the need for sharing data. But it's a balance. The law says, let it be up to the person to decide what data they wish to share. But the law provides for specific sets of data that are classified for public good. Let's say pandemic information, or statistical information, or other information that is scientific or known to serve public good. So, if there is an outbreak, then data can be legally collected for purposes of serving. And in that case, the individual consent is not the overriding feature. Because this data is still legally collected for the purpose of, say, fighting a pandemic like COVID. So you wouldn't say because there is data protection law, I'm not going to be tested for COVID. No. The law provides that you still, in the interest of public good, provide that data. So the law is very, very well thought through. It protects you, but also preserves the public good. And that is a balance, but in the end, the right belongs to the consent of the individual.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you very much. We've come to the tail end, but as is customary, let's just hear one last round. David, you can sit this one out. From Roland coming this way, maybe you could also mention maybe what the future is within the World Development Report and what was mentioned, what remains to be done within that space, as we give the final word on this topic.
Thank you. I've found this to be a very interesting conversation, and one of the things that strikes me as I'm listening, David, is we have been supporting digital development. Rwanda sees, the digital space as an important space for accelerating its development across the board. And most recently, we approved an operation, $100 million from the World Bank, $100 million from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank to support Rwanda across a number of things. So first, participation and inclusion in the digital economy of poor women and rural communities. The second really works on that centerpiece of e-government. Rwanda has done a really good job as migrating certain services electronically, and we're trying to help and do more of that to enhance its capacity to leverage digital platforms and to essentially improve or increase data-driven solutions to expand and improve public service delivery. And it's in this space that we are supporting the development of national data governance and management frameworks, and in particular, the operationalization of Rwanda's new data protection law. So I'm very excited because I see how much interest there is, that we are putting our resources at a place that it will be well used. And David, you're coming under pressure, but that just means that you're really important. That's how I would see it anyway. The last component of what we're doing speaks to a lot that you mentioned as well, Georgie, in terms of startups. So there's a third piece that we're supporting to improve the success and growth of digitally enabled startups in Rwanda, and to position the country as a regional hub for innovation and entrepreneurship. And it's exciting to me because this is really the start of it. The project became effective 2 days ago, and we're going to be able to see, hopefully, lots of results on the ground for a broad cross-section of the population. I think the other piece that I would mention is the bank. Oftentimes people talk about money because we are the World Bank, but one of the things that we try to do is to be a thought leader, to do analytical work that will help drive sort of broad policy. And we have a flagship report every year called the World Development Report. And this year, that report is on data, and it's called Data for Better Lives. And a critical piece, or one of the main takeaways for that report, it's long, we like long reports, lots of details, 9 different chapters. Take it to your bedroom because it is good nighttime reading. If you have insomnia, it will put you right out within 10 minutes, I'm sure. But if you read it outside, in the daylight, there are really important bits of information. One of the key takeaways, the sort of calls from that report, is for a new social contract that enables the use and reuse of data to create economic and social value, right? How is it that we're going to better the lives, particularly of the poorest and most vulnerable? We also want to ensure that there is equitable access to that value, right? Not just the elite, but also to people who are poor. How is it that they're going to be able to utilize that to make a benefit, right? So not just also for big corporations, but also for small corporations as needed. And lastly, because this is so important, right? We know about the helpful parts of data, we know about the harmful parts of data. And so the last piece of this social contract is essentially fostering trust that data will not be misused. And of course, that's where you come in, David. So thank you so much. It says to me that we're doing work that's relevant, because this is, of course, a huge topic, and that's broadly in World Bank globally, but also at a national level, that we're supporting a really important piece of Rwanda's sort of development landscape. Thank you.
Thank you. Chido, let's hear about it from the Africa level, the regional level.
Yeah, so from the Africa level, the market for e-commerce in Africa, based on 2020 data, is about $20 billion US dollars. In France, it's $54 billion, just to give you a comparison. So if we're going to scale digital trade and services and goods on the continent, as I mentioned before, and we'll keep repeating, we're going to need uniform standards, cooperation, and consistency across jurisdictions. And so there are many different measures that are taking place to try to achieve this. At the World Economic Forum, we have our data protection platform, a platform of experts from around the world, from different sectors who've come up with a roadmap for best practices for cross-border data flows. And I think, different types of multi-stakeholder processes such as this and what Rwanda is doing, hopefully this will become the template that's scaled in the region and inspires other countries in order to create some sort of minimum standard for data protection. So yeah, that's my message, uniformity, consistency, and cooperation. Absolutely perfect.
Yeah, and yay to seeing a template that can actually be replicated, right? All right, so we'll hold, again, just one more thing to hold you to creation of a template that can be replicated across different jurisdictions, of course customized to what they need. Final point from you, Alain, especially knowing that the center has been officially launched.
Yes. Yeah. So if we talk about this new data revolution and the new so-called data economy, we really need to think about how we interact with each other, especially through policy and regulation that really makes sense within our context, but also a regulation and policy that doesn't stifle innovation or research. A lot of the policies, like you mentioned at the beginning, at the introduction, they're very fragmented, and I would call them dinosaur policies or dinosaur regulations. They're really trying to protect nations within their context. But as we start talking about collaboration across borders, we really need to start thinking how we're going to unlock this value of data we're talking about through mechanisms such as those kind of David had mentioned for cross-border data flows and so on. So it's really important that we start having these discussions, and the best option is, again, having this multi-stakeholder approach to problem solving that includes voices both from the public sector, private sector, academia, and civil society, just to make sense of what really would work, and also piloting a lot of this just to test. So I think one of the issues that we make all these beautiful rules and regulations, but we're scared to actually implement because there's no framework in place to do that. So that's why the center is around. We partner with different stakeholders in piloting some of these frameworks just to ensure that it really makes sense so that you can customize them according to your context. So I just want to throw that in there, and thank you.
Right, and you're the project lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning, right? So for you, you must be analyzing data over the last even 30, 50 years, right, to project what the future is.
Yes, I think this goes back also to the other question you asked about SMEs participation.
Yeah.
So one issue maybe they didn't mention is that a lot of the data we have locally is fragmented. There's no data policy in place that really sets the standards for data that's ready to be consumed by these machines and these algorithms that we keep on talking about. So there's still groundwork. Before we even talk about regional, what are we doing even within our institution? Maybe this is something you can take away home within your institution. Do you have a data policy that really defines the standards, how you're keeping the data, how is it interoperable in the sense that you can exchange it with other partners and so on. So those are things that we're looking at, enabling that environment to happen, and hoping that within a few years from now, Rwanda will be in the best position to be a pioneer in those fields.
All right, sounds good. Please, warm round of applause. Thank you very much for your time. So not all data is good data, useful data. We have what we're putting you to account. And of course, on a regional level, Chido, we'll make sure of that. Keep the money coming. And being a thought leader, of course. And of course, we're looking to you to make sure that the fragmented approach, you find a way around that as the center progresses as well. Thank you. Thank you all for your audience and the questions.